Hello, everyone. We're just going to be getting started shortly. We're just waiting for everyone to join. Hi, and good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining. I hope you're all well wherever you're listening from around the world. I'm your host, Gautam Badri, a current client of USA Corporate Services. We are live from New York City, right next to the world-famous Empire State Building, and it's my pleasure to introduce your presenter for today, John Gordon. John is the president of USA Corporate Services, and he loves helping non-US based entrepreneurs overcome legal, tax, immigration, and cultural challenges to set up their US company. He also serves on the board of Columbia Business School's Alumni Club of New York. He's a yoga practicing, home beer brewing, company founder, board member, husband, father, and someone who can go on for hours about history, politics, and other neat stuff. Today's presentation is on how to set up an import-export company in the US. So if you want a piece of the $4.9 trillion of trade the US does each year, you're in the right place. John is joined online today by Yichen Ma from our marketing team. Yichen will be handling the Q&A today. Speaking of which, we've had lots of questions already, and we'll answer as many as we can during this webinar. If you have any questions as we go, please click on the Q&A button on your screen. And before you ask, yes, a recording of the webinar will be made available afterwards. Right, I know you're all keen to learn the ins and outs, so over to you, John.
Thank you, Gautam. Hi, everyone. Thanks for attending today. And, well, thanks to Gautam for that wonderful introduction. Are you sure that's me you're talking about? People have been drawn to the U.S. market for its huge size, open competition, and, well, the large food portions. In today's webinar, we'll be discussing how to set up an import-export company in the U.S. If you have questions, please let us know through the little Q&A tabby thing that should be showing in the upper left or the lower left of your screen. And before we wrap up, we're going to have a section for Q&A. Now, to get started, the first thing we're going to talk about is whether do you need to set up a U.S. company at all? May sound odd for someone from the company formation industry to suggest you might not need a company, but it's better for you to think about this now than further down the road and after you've invested a lot of time for no reason. So, naturally, the key thing is, how big is your company going to be? Will it be big enough to justify all the overhead of maintaining a company, as well as trying to support a business in another country? So, will you be earning enough based on what you think you'll be able to sell? If the amount is below, let's say, $50,000 per year, you may not have enough to make it worthwhile. In that case, you can work with a distributor or work with consignment deals, or there's different arrangements that you could make so you don't go through all the overhead. So once you set up a company in the US, there's a lot of rules that you will be subject to, the most famous being taxes. There's also you'll be part of the US liability system. So once you become an importer of record, if import is what you're doing, then you become permanently liable for what those products have done during the time that they're still in the market. So it's something to really think about before going through the rest of the process. So assuming that the answer, after getting the scary first part here, assuming that you still want to go, This is a summary of the requirements that you'll have to go through to set up a business. First, you set up the company, but then you'll have to set up the rest of the processes and procedures of generating business and getting going. So we're going to go through these steps, of which the first one, of course, is location. The United States is a federal system, and the federal system is kind of like, imagine a big condominium high-rise where you have 50 units, but the condo association itself has its own rules and all the tenants have to follow them. But within your condo, you can make a lot of your own rules as long as they don't go past, as long as they fit within the rules of the condo association. If the condo association says no open fires in your condo, then obviously you can't have one. But other than that, they tend to make their own rules. Now this starts to make a difference because you see the next to location is the state of incorporation. These two things don't have to be the same. So let's worry about where you're going to physically locate your business, assuming that you're going to be setting it up physically within the United States. So you have the choice of 50 states. 2 are missing from this map, but chances are if you're importing, you're going to be in the continental United States. So there's going to be a lot of decisions to make. And at the end of the day, a friend of mine is a location consultant, and he likes to point out that, we can provide a lot of data, but it's really what the client wants that's going to determine it. Some people like warm weather and want to be in Florida. Some people like the culture you would get in New York City. Some people like the laid-back atmosphere of California. Some people like the Wild West or going to Texas. So you never know. So when it comes to methods of choosing a location, where to put your business, there's these 3 methods, one of which is either actually taping a map of the United States to a dartboard, start throwing darts. Okay, that works. It's very fast and can be kind of fun, but your chances of success are just as random. At the other extreme is hiring a consultant. That's a lot more expensive. People like my friend are not cheap. They will do a lot of work, but again, underneath it all, they're still going to be looking at you for what is it that you really want? How would you define success? So that's where the self-directed method falls in between. You're going to learn a lot because you have no choice. So you get a lot of insights into the overall market, and then you can make your choice from there. So this is our 5-step method of choosing a location. Start from the end. What would a successful import or export business look like? What do you need in order to make it successful, which is step 2. What are the steps? Do you need to be close to people? Do you need to be close to your market? Do you need to be close to resources? Do you, also, are you worried about high taxes? Chances are, if there's a lot of people, highly educated people, the taxes in those areas tend to be higher than if you go into a more rural area where there's less services, less people. It's also less taxes. So as you start to think, what are the locations from step 2 that really meet those requirements? And you can start to put together a list of those places that start to meet it. Which ones have the most pluses? Which ones do you like the most but have the least negatives to them? There's no place that's perfect. So what's the least imperfect place? And then from that, pick a finalist so you can go on to the next step. Next step is now we cross into that second box from before. Do you want to be incorporated in the same state that you just picked? Or would another state, which usually ends up being Delaware, would that be better for you? It's going to cost you more, no question about it. If you incorporate in a different state, the bigger your company, the less that the expense really matters. But even a big company often started off as small and very concerned about its expenses. So there really should be a good reason to incorporate someplace besides where you're located. So at the end of the day, over the years, these are the main reasons that people don't incorporate in the same state where they're located. If you're looking to get venture capital, then chances are the venture capitalists and quite a few large angel investors, they want you to be in Delaware. We'll go into Delaware's benefits shortly, but that's just the way it is. If you're operating across several states, we have a number of customers who they'll set up, say, in Georgia, but then they want to be in, say, Florida, Texas, California, as they start expanding their services. In that case, you might as well, for the extra expense is no longer all that much, incorporate in Delaware, get the lowest amount of, the corporate rules for governance are less intrusive than in most states. So Delaware would make sense there. The next one is a situation that happens more often than you might think. You start off and you're not sure where you want to end up. Your location search was, you couldn't find a good choice of balances, so you just want to get started. But realize that maybe you're going to change your mind. There was somebody I met a while back who, she was a Columbia MBA. She and her husband wanted to start a business. And so we met at one of the network gatherings. And so she found out what I did and of course asked this kind of question. She's in New York, but they're going to be moving to Pennsylvania by the end of the year. But they're thinking that, well, maybe they'll go on to the West Coast afterwards, but they're not sure. So they said, where should you incorporate? In that kind of ambiguity, I said, well, then incorporate in Delaware. Because that's one of the easiest places to migrate from here to there without worrying about changing your state of location. If you start in Delaware and but you're physically in New York, then you register to do business in New York, and then when you leave the state, you just file basically a cancellation of that registration, and that's it. You're done with New York. Then you just register to do business in Pennsylvania. If they move, fine. They can just move. If they don't move, great, they're all set. So it's this way that they never change their tax number. They can keep all the same bank accounts. They keep the same credit rating. They keep the same contracts. Everything is consistent. The last reason, and this happens sometimes, is you just don't like the disclosure laws of the state that you're in. Some states ask a lot of questions. They seem to never be happy. Well, in that case, fine. You can go to another state like Delaware where they don't really ask much and then register to do business in that state. I don't know that that's the best reason, but that's what some people like. So, and it's probably a good time to mention about what's a foreign registration, because this one really confuses a lot of people. Each of the states likes to pretend that it's an independent country because it does make a lot of it their own rules. And so if something wasn't created in that state, then it's foreign. If a company was formed in a particular state, then it's domestic to that state. So for example, if you're here in New York and your LLC was created in New York, that's a domestic LLC. If the LLC was created in the state of New Jersey, or if it was created over in the Isle of Jersey, one of the Channel Islands, those are both equally foreign to the state of New York. So in either case, they would just be considered a foreign company. One of the reasons that they call it a foreign registration is that because of our Constitution, each state has to recognize the equivalent of another state's, well, stuff. So if you notarize something in New York, it's valid in California. If you form a company in Utah, it's valid in Vermont. So for everything from license plates and registrations to other stuff, each state has to honor what was done in the other state. So if you're a Delaware company doing business in Pennsylvania, then you have to do a foreign registration in Pennsylvania, so your Delaware company is legally doing business there. If you don't, most states have some kind of penalty for you. At the least, you can't use their court system. A lot of people think that's not really a big deal until they had the first big contract for payment, and no payment comes in. So of course you want to sue for collection. Then they find out that they can't because they're not registered to do business there. As far as the state's concerned, you don't exist. So how can a non-existing company sue the existing company for the payment that wasn't made? So this is one of the reasons that you really need to register where you do business. LLCs versus corporations. Everybody likes to ask us this question, which one's better? So I like to think of being back in high school. I had a teacher named Mrs. Walsh. She was a math teacher. She was a dragon. Everything had to be perfect. Assignments on time, you better show up for class on time. Everything had to be done just right, exactly the way she wanted it. Each step in the calculation had to be exactly the way that she told you it was going to be. Everything was rigid. It's all set out properly. Mrs. Walsh would like corporations. I had another teacher named Mrs. Smith. She was very, we would call it loosey-goosey. Chinese would say, 随便, following convenience. LLCs are great for lazy people because, like Mrs. Smith's technique, as long as you learn your stuff and you get it done by the end of the semester, well, you get your grade and you're done. So there's no big deal. There's no tight regulations. Things are however it is you want to work it out, as long as it all gets done properly. Now, if you're dealing with tax law, if you're dealing with immigration as a non-resident, then you wish you were in Mrs. Walsh's class with a corporation, with everything being very rigidly set out, everything from how money is distributed. If you want to distribute profits from the company, it can only go to shareholders through dividends, which the board authorizes. An LLC, well, if you're the sole member of the LLC, you can take out your money pretty much anytime. As far as the taxes are concerned, it's all the same pocket, so there's no real regulation. It's all kind of, again, loosey-goosey. But a corporation, if you're an officer, say the president or treasurer or CEO or bottle washer, your compensation is probably going to be set by the board. And if you take anything more than that, well, that's stealing. So you have to, corporations, everything is very carefully documented. But an LLC, well, things might end up being all over the place. You might have a non-resident tax return with some of your information. You might have some local tax returns that you could provide as evidence, but it's really just not very well organized. As opposed to with a corporation, well, it's going to be very well organized. You don't have much choice. Another thing for the difference between corporations and LLCs is that sometimes an LLC can give you a lower tax rate than a corporation can, because of the way that LLCs can avoid double taxation. They can take advantage of tax laws, and corporations cannot. Again, Mrs. Walsh will not let you change your tax status. Mrs. Smith says, yeah, that's okay, as long as it all gets paid by the end. So you may have to leave Mrs. Smith's class, because if you're trying to get visas in particular, where you have a business plan, you have to show contribution, you have to show value that you've done something, the stricter rules is going to work better for you. Okay, so now you've picked a location, you've decided where you want to be set up, and you've also decided which type of entity. Now you're ready to set up a company. So when we do this incorporating process, first you're going to register your documents with the government where you're going to be incorporated, and in other states if needed. That's a foreign registration part. Now, part of registering your company is coming up with a name. That also might be a bit more complicated than you might think. We often ask, can we use the name of the foreign company, parent company, for a subsidiary? The answer is yes, as long as it's available and nobody else has taken it. Some people have asked us whether taking a name in one state stops people from taking it in other states, and the answer is no. States only care about what goes on within their own borders. So once you've incorporated in one state, it doesn't stop anybody, including a competitor, from using the same name in the next state over. It's just the way the rules are. So once you've registered the company, you've gone with the you've done all your documentation, gotten everything all set up. Then in order to do almost anything in the United States, your company will have to get a federal employer identification number, which is also known as a federal tax ID, or federal tax number. If you're a non-resident without a social security number, yes, it can be done, but now it's been taking a couple of weeks to get a response. The IRS seems to be slowing that process down more and more. Then as you get since now you have a real company, now you set out your organizational documents. This will confirm who owns the company, which is the shareholders or the members, if it's an LLC. And now it sets out who's going to operate the company, the management, which would be directors and officers of a corporation or the managers of an LLC. Then they adopt the operating agreement or the bylaws, depending on which type of company it is. This is also very important because when you go to set up a bank account, they want to see who owns the company and who is managing the company, who is authorized to do stuff. So by the time you get to the bank, you're going to need a tax number and you're going to need to show who is authorized to do what. Going to open a bank account is the one part which definitely requires a visit to the United States. If you don't come to the United States, then whatever bank you're using is in violation of the Patriot Act, which requires banks to know who their customers are, and they must have either met the customer at the branch or at their place of business. This is something that's only getting more and more strict. The requirements are getting harder and harder every year. So this has become by far the most difficult part of this whole process. So now you have a bank account, you've got your company set up. Now you're ready to start leasing office space and just generally conduct business. So now you have a company and you want to start doing your import or export or both. Actually, an expert once told me that if you think that you have an import company and you're not an exporter, what do you do with returns and vice versa? I would say that the first thing you need to do, absolutely need to do, is find a good customs broker. If the crazy quilt of corporate laws around the United States, since each state is all different, if you think that's complicated, customs are set out by the federal government, but their regulations are just as all over the place. It's really, really difficult to make sure that your goods will come in when and where you want them to. The customs broker can ask you the right questions so that when they get asked questions by the customs people, that they can answer them and then expedite getting it on to you or to your customers. If you've not been doing that, if you don't use a customs broker, your odds of getting stuff through consistently is very, very low. Another thing you're going to have to know about is the various state and federal regulations about your product before you set up your company. We have friends who are setting up an import company to bring tea in from Taiwan. It's been taking a bit longer than they expected because there's just so many regulations. And even though the product is very simple, there's a lot of rules. As things get more complicated, like if you were trying to smuggle in weapons, or naturally if you're trying to import pharmaceuticals of different types, there's a lot of regulations. But this being America, probably the hardest regulation is trying to import wines and other alcohol. That stuff gets very complicated. So if you don't, it's cheaper all around if you find out the regulations before you even try to set up your company. Then once you become familiar with those federal and state regulations, now you can confirm, so what licenses and permits will you need? Since in the past, we've dealt with all sorts of companies. So one thing that we do know is it's too complicated in a 1-hour webinar to try to explain what any of these things would be. There's just all sorts of stuff. And again, it's at 2 different levels. Step 4 is the one that's often the most forgotten. What insurances will you need to carry? And then what do you have to do to get them? Because just because you can go out and buy a policy, but insurance companies are notorious for finding out how they can get out of paying you. So if you have One thing you will definitely have to get is product liability insurance, because once you become importer of record, well, you're going to be tagged with that. And product liability is a huge thing in the United States. So if you're going to have to carry that one, you'll also have different types of insurances depending on if you hire people. There's going to be, and of course, you may want to think about getting health insurance, as you may have heard about the United States and the healthcare system or lack of it. So these are all things that are, step 4 is probably the most forgotten step of setting up a US company. And if you're importing products or exporting and you're not sure what can go wrong, then I suggest you find a very good broker and have a long discussion. Insurance is not a very exciting topic, but it can also kill your business. And step 5, now go out and get them. So if you've been finding out, once you've formed a company, then now it's time for you to go out and get all these licenses, permits, insurance, and whatnot. Everybody asks us about taxes. The one thing you can expect is that, yes, there will be a lot of taxes. This is something people often want us to predict before they set up the company. It's not going to happen. No one, not even a CPA with a doctorate, is going to be able to explain to you what your taxes will be before you've submitted all the documentation to prepare a return. Because you have federal income taxes, state income taxes, state sales taxes, there's local taxes, which could be anything from city taxes. For example, New York City has a city income tax as well as if you live here. So you get to pay a city income tax, a state income tax, a federal income tax. There's also property taxes. There's, it just goes on and on and on. So, and in general, they fall into, there's taxes on your business, and then there's taxes on you. So as you see here, there's commerce taxes and consumer taxes. These categories are a little bit misleading because a business becomes a consumer when they buy a product. If you go down to the store and you buy copy paper or pens that you're going to use at your office, you're a consumer. It doesn't matter if you're a business. So, as an employer, you're going to pay taxes. As a property owner, you're going to pay taxes. And in a lot of places, as a renter, you may end up helping the landlord to pay his property taxes. And there's investment taxes. So this is just part of the complication of doing business in the United States. Next year. So the second year, you definitely got to prepare tax returns, as we said from the previous slide. And then depending on what state you're in or how many states you're in, you can be preparing annual reports and paying annual fees for your company to the Secretary of State or whichever agency that state collects. If you have visas, then you're going to have to make sure you can prepare the documentation for renewals on those. And then it's just wise to do a review of progress and make your adjustments to your business model matches. Now, going back a little bit on taxes, this is a good time to mention that federal taxes apply equally throughout the United States. There are states, to me, Nevada comes to mind mostly, but some people think that Delaware has this as well. That is some kind of domestic tax haven that's not subject to taxes. No. Federal taxes apply to all U.S. persons. And your company would, when you set up a U.S. company, it's a U.S. person. It's going to pay federal taxes no matter what. Just because you incorporated, let's say in Nevada, which often markets itself as tax-free Nevada, that's true. They have no state income tax. If you set up a Nevada company and you register to do business in California, well, you're going to pay California taxes no matter what because you're in California. You'll pay federal taxes because you're a U.S. entity in the United States. You won't pay Nevada taxes because Nevada doesn't have company income tax, but they do have quite a few fees you'll be stuck paying. So the other thing is that Nevada won't tax your income. Delaware says the same thing. If you earn money outside of Delaware, you won't pay Delaware tax or you wouldn't pay Nevada tax. This is all true. But it's also true that if you incorporate in California and you earn all your income in Utah, you won't pay anything more than the minimum California tax because you're not in California and they can't tax you. So this doesn't make California a good offshore location, but it does mean that it's misleading to say that Nevada was tax-free. If you're not there, of course there's no tax. They wouldn't be able to tax you no matter where you came from because you're not there. Now, expertise that you'll need. Well, one thing that I can tell you from the experience of customers is you will need an accountant because virtually any American business uses an accountant. You can't do it on your own. But if you're a non-resident, you will need an accountant with international tax experience. Don't rely on the help of an inexperienced but cheap accountant who only has domestic experience. You can be like one of our clients who found out that the cheap accountant that they went to after ignoring our advice, well, they saved money up front. But guess what? This accountant didn't realize they had to file this thing called Form 4571. And that's for any company, LLC or corporation that has more than 25% ownership that's not US resident. So failure to file this form is a $10,000 penalty. So they may have saved maybe $1,000 by getting a cheap accountant. They also had to pay a $10,000 penalty because this cheap accountant didn't realize. And they also ignored the 30-day notice the IRS gave them as a warning that, by the way, you didn't file this form on time, but we'll give you 30 days to catch up. The accountants ignored it. Then they got the real notice that said no more timeout, pay. Then the accountants realized that they were on the hook. It's really because if they tried to force the client to pay it, well, the client can turn around and sue the accountant. So the accountants begged the IRS for a little extra time and apparently it worked it all out. But this was a lot of needless stress because they just didn't have the proper experience. We know of companies that have tried to take this cheap route and within a year they found out that that's not a good idea. The customs broker we already talked about, that's something that it's just not going to work well. It has no happy ending if you try to get stuff into the United States past the customs people who look for irregularities and they can recategorize stuff as this or that. It's just not worth it. Just hire a customs broker, pay them and get it done right. You'll need a registered agent for your company. I hope you choose us. One of the things that a registered agent can do on top of just acting as somebody who accepts service of process is that they can also tell you when things are due, what certain things actually mean. Yeah, it's just, well, depends on the skill of the registered agent, I guess. Lawyers. And the reason that lawyers are down here on the second roll is that, well, they tend to specialize because the laws in the United States are very, very complex. So an immigration lawyer probably is not good at intellectual property. In fact, if they're good at intellectual property, don't go for them for immigration. The intellectual property guy can help make sure that your trademarks can be registered properly, which is good if you want to preserve your own brand. They can file patents to protect you against copycats. They know a lot about the timing, or for that matter, and this is something that plays back with the customs broker. You might be importing goods, and then it turns out that you're infringing on somebody's trademark, and the customs people are getting all upset. You may need the lawyers, as well as the customs broker, to sort that one out. And the corporate one, if you're setting up a pretty basic, either a subsidiary or this is an entrepreneurial venture, for very basic company work, you may not need a lawyer. If you're starting to get investment, talking about serious money, then yes, we would definitely recommend when you need legal work, get it done properly, and find somebody who knows what they're doing. Now, if you're hiring staff, you will definitely need a payroll service. If you think you're going to figure out the different rules of the 50 states, that's tough. Most US companies now use a payroll service because what's some of the local governments will do, or sometimes the IRS, they can come back to you several years later and say, oh, we reviewed your Form 941 and we found irregularities and you owe us X amount of dollars. But Payroll Service, they can argue much more easily probably than you can. And they should have all the records all in the right place, and they just push back and say, no, you don't, or they can tell you, oh, yes, you do. Sorry, it was our mistake, or sorry, it was your mistake. You didn't report something. So these are the different experts at the minimum that you're going to need in order to successfully get your business off the ground and out of trouble. So that's enough talking for me for a moment. So before we wrap this up, we'll open up the floor to new questions. Okay, Mario Lopez has an interesting question. Your business is projected to make $15,000 a year or more. Is it worth it to continue with the idea? Actually, I was saying 50,000. And I would say that I was really thinking gross, but then again, it depends on your markup. So it would be, depends on how big you want your company to become. Kunal asked the question of how would Florida state laws for incorporating a company as compared to Delaware? Well, I would say that at the end of the day, most states have very similar provisions, and over time, they tend to converge. So if you're comparing Delaware or with Wisconsin or Florida or Texas, you will, as a small business, small to medium, you probably won't see a whole lot of difference. At the end of the day, if you want something that's not where you're located, then again, we always fall back on just go to Delaware. Chances are Delaware is 1/3 of Delaware's state budget. How they pay their bills every year comes from the incorporating business. So they try to make sure that every year they review the law. So if somebody's come up with a good idea, next year it's going to be in Delaware's law. The other states, well, they may experiment, or they may just ignore it for several years, or it could be like New York and things go dysfunctional for a few years, and then they wake up and then they correct everything, and then they go back to sleep. So that's where Delaware has a benefit. But if you're thinking to set up in Florida, then probably you can just incorporate in Florida. GF asked the question, do I need to register my company all states where I keep my inventory in? In general, yes. Unless it's a very small amount or it's only for a short period of time. The more involved you are with a state, the more it is that you're likely to have to register. And while I hate to be vague about that, most state laws don't come out and say, if you do this, then yes, you have to register. States prefer the opposite method, which infuriates everyone and makes us all say, it depends. Because they'll say, well, if you open a bank account in a state and that's your only activity, then you're not doing business here. Okay. But then they have rules like that things that you probably wouldn't really notice too much. So usually the bright lines though is that if you've hired somebody to work for you in that state, then you have to register. If you keep inventory in that state, you probably have to register. If you definitely if you have an office, if you own real property, you are doing business in that state. You'll never get away with saying that, oh, I didn't know. So if you have substantial inventory, then yes, especially if you're keeping it there on a long-term basis. Hatham is asking, for import and export company to expand business, need to add more property. Do I need to change the type of company? Then no, you shouldn't have to change the type of company that you have, even if you grow larger. Either type of company can grow as large as you need it to. There's some very large LLCs. There's a lot of very small corporations. It's not the entity, it's how much, how strict you want to be. And as you can, with an LLC, sure, you can do business inside the United States. But if you were doing business outside the United States before, and then you start to do business inside the United States, then you're going to have to start filing non-resident tax returns. Or if you become a resident, then of course you have to file a resident tax return. That would be your main difference. Accounting for the time outside the US, generally you would just, in your tax number application, you would just say date started business, would be much later than the date of formation. For the question how to find good import-export opportunities, there's actually a number of websites. Unfortunately, I don't have them with me right now, but yes, there are. I wish I could remember. Fad, if you want to ask me later, I can send it to you, or we could put it into a follow-up. Tarang, as an Indian citizen, I want to set up a software company with a low tax rate. Which company will be good? Well, if we would usually recommend just going with Delaware, because if your business is outside the U.S., one of the ways that they determine where you're doing business is where is the economic activity taking place. So if you have an LLC, but the business is all being done outside the US, then you may not be considered to be doing tax, but I would suggest that you get a very good accountant to speak to first, because this is the kind of ambiguity that the tax authorities love. Okay, Francisco asks a great question. If the sourced income is non-US, it is not subject to federal taxes, as I understand. That depends. If you have a US corporation, there's no, with one vague exception, it's definitely subject to federal tax. Corporations are US person, they're subject to income tax on all their income worldwide, so it doesn't matter if it's non-sourced. Now, there was a proposed tax change, a border adjustment, that would have made us very happy for our business, because if all our non-US, if we're considered to be exporting companies, then all revenue that we earned would be considered non-taxable, but we still maintain all the deductions for paying the state filing fees. We would have been very happy, but that's not the law. So we continue to pay taxes on our worldwide income. Now for an LLC, this is often true. If you're a non-resident using a US LLC and you have both US and non-US income, My understanding is you can exclude the non-US income, which makes it a benefit. And if we register in Delaware, does it matter where our location address is? Yes. So if you register in Delaware, but you're doing business in Pennsylvania, even though they're right next to each other, then you're doing business in Pennsylvania and you have to register to do business there. If you're earning income in Pennsylvania, then you're subject to federal and Pennsylvania tax. Yes, we can recommend customs brokers. We can send that out as a follow-up. Great question. Is it mandatory to have an employee? No, it's not. That's a great question because it's a very easy yes, no. I don't have to say it depends. Well, unless you're trying to get a E2 or some type of investor visa, or if your company would be applying for L1s for the management, then yes, you would have to have employees. E2 and other investment type visas, it's the creation of jobs that justifies the visa according to Congress. So yes, you would have to hire employees. But in general, if you're just setting up a US business and then just getting it started, then no, you don't have to have any employees. Quite a few companies do not. As a matter of fact, in America, it's very common to own real property, buildings and land through using an LLC, which would have no employees. It just owns a piece of property or owns an asset. Yes, actually, we have resources on our website that you can go to at usa-corporate.com. We have resources which has the international tax accountant, lawyers, and customs brokers. As a Canadian citizen, Canada is in a very unique situation because it's being so close to the United States, it's very easy to see all the literature about how easy LLCs are compared to corporations. If you're from Canada, well, don't use an LLC unless you enjoy double taxation. It's actually worse than a corporation on the US side. A corporation would get a tax credit against any US corporate taxes and withholding taxes. An LLC does not. It's not the American fault, it's the way that the Canadian law works. So, but if you come to run a company in the United States, there's different visas that you could use. But yes, in order to work for your company within the United States, then you would have to have some type of visa. Unless Mr. Trump gets rid of NAFTA, you can use the TN9 visa to come in, and that's where you would present your documentation at the border when you cross. The only risk in the TN is that if the border guard's going through a divorce or is otherwise very upset, can look at your documentation, refuse to let you in, there's no appeal, you have to go home. So that's about the only downside of the TN that I know of. Otherwise, it lets you work within the United States. The other thing you can do is just officially work. If your US company pays you to work outside the United States, then no visa is required. Except for, of course, to come in through visa waiver. Location consulting is several $1,000s at least, but how expensive it would be depends on what you're doing. If you're thinking to set up a unique, some kind of stylized Irish pub that's going to be in somewhere in the East Coast, that I don't know if it's all that expensive, to be several thousand, but compared to, say, setting up a new auto parts manufacturing factory, that's going to be a lot more expensive. Immigration lawyer, yes, we work with a couple, and they're also listed on our website at usa-corporate.com. If the parent company is in the UAE, which is tax-free, and you open branches, then you will be subject to US tax and a branch profits tax in the United States. It does the tax-free part. If it's tax-free outside the United States, that's irrelevant within the United States. L1 visa times, as far as I know, they can still be expedited, unlike H1B. So expedited is, well, most visa processing goes from a few weeks to several weeks to a few months. Congress and the new administration keep cutting back on staffing at these places, at the CIS that handles visas. So it's not fun to get a visa right now. Okay, here's a question about regulations to import food to the United States. I would start with Customs and Border Patrol. I would speak with a customs broker, and you can be sure that the Food and Drug Administration will also have something to say about it. There may well be local regulations as well. So I think the best way to start, though, is just talking with a customs broker, because they're the ones who are going to have to try to help you get it through. Third-party warehouse storage. The quick answer is yes. If you still hold title to your products, that's your inventory, even if it's someone else's warehouse. So the fact that you have product being stored in a state, usually that would be considered a reason to require an application for authority. How do you choose a customs broker correctly? Very good question. That's something that in a way, it's the same way you would choose any kind of help. That talk to them, see if they really. You can even test them out a bit, see if they have references they can give or stories they can tell about how things have gone right, how things have gone wrong, what did they learn about. Because once you've discussed with them to find out, do they have? I'd also want to find out if they have experience in bringing in what I'm bringing. If somebody has been bringing in lumber into the United States or oil, but you want to import tea, I don't know if that experience crosses over. But if somebody's been bringing in food and beverages, and you want to import tea, then they probably have some pretty good ideas about what's required. Okay, GF, you have a very good question. Can I set up a corporation that operates two businesses, like an import-export business and a consulting business? The short answer is yes. And the answer that, if you want to think like an American who's been experienced in business, you would set up two companies. And the reason is, if you have two companies which are in different fields and they have different levels of risk, they have different customer base, you'd want to split those two companies apart. You want to split them into two separate operations. That way you can see, is your import-export company, is it making money? Is it losing money? If you mix it with a consulting business, and consulting is doing really well and import is losing money, you may not see it because all you see is that, oh, we're making money. Also, import-export is going to have one level of risk, including being, for example, importer of record. You don't want something that blows up on you there to affect your consulting business, which should be in a whole different risk category. And the thing with consulting is that the risk there is usually errors and omissions, or somebody just doesn't like your work. So why would you risk your import-export company against an angry consulting client? So generally speaking, it makes more sense to split these into two companies, but legally, sure, you can either operate different businesses under a same LLC or corporation, or you can mix and match as you like. There's no, or you can even do different businesses sequentially if that's your thing. You can be doing import export for the next 2 years and then decide you're bored, you want to do consulting because there's more money in it, stop import export and then just start consulting. Same company, doesn't matter. That's perfectly legal. It's the opposite of some countries where when you set up your company, you have to set out the scope of what you're going to do, and then that's all you can do. Here, it's the opposite. There's things that you cannot do because you need a license, or like if you're an import export, you can't offer medical services unless you're a doctor, and that's going to be a different type of company. But so as long as it's not a restricted thing, you can do as many different types of businesses as your imagination lets you, or that customers will pay you. If you're thinking, Tracy McLaren is asking if we're a UK company and export US goods to Africa or other places, are you better off incorporating a company in the US or getting a customs broker to handle this? You could go either way. You probably wouldn't have much US income tax if you do just purchasing through your UK company, you can probably just use the customs broker and then try to avoid US tax altogether. The US company would probably end up earning, if you use an LLC, you might also be able to avoid the non-US source income because the purchasing would not be considered taxable activity since you're spending money, not earning it. So in your case, if it was me, I think I would get tax advice from somebody who knows what they're talking about. And then 2, assuming that it is what I think it is, then I would just use an LLC, again, as a non-resident. As a US resident, I'd probably use an LLC anyway because it's easier. Elton has the perfect question I was going to mention earlier. If I sell internet services like email accounts in a different state, do I need to pay taxes on that state? Thank you, Elton. You reminded me of a point I was going to make earlier. It doesn't matter where your customers are for tax purposes or for registering to do business. It only matters where you are. If you're, let's say you're in the beautiful state of Vermont up in the mountains, and all your customers are in California, you're going to pay income tax at the state level in Vermont. Again, your federal taxes are going to be the same, it doesn't matter. But you don't pay California income tax because you didn't earn anything in California. You're in Vermont. And even though all your customers were over there, doesn't matter. They send the money to Vermont, you do what you do, they get the goods or whatever it is. So you have no, in that sense, you have no connection to the state of California. You pay taxes in that state where you're actually doing business. It also works with purchasing. Just because you buy all your goods from California, then you sell them in Vermont and you're located in Vermont. Again, you haven't done anything in California, there's no tax due there. Skating a little bit onto thin ice with the L1A question. It says, as per L1A, I have to hire an employee, which would be someone from my place to look after the business. Does it have any minimum wages salary for the manager? Yes. If you have an employee, then this goes back to the big condominium of the United States. The federal law sets minimum wages, and there's actually, you cannot discriminate, and you have to pay at least minimum wage for the hours worked. States can make it even tougher. So they can have states, or like the city of New York has an even higher minimum wage. So yes, you would have minimum wages to pay, and then you have to be careful about which state that you're dealing with to know what that minimum wage would be. Okay, another good question from Dixon Lowe. Should we get a visa before incorporation, or should it be the other way around? You can't get a visa before incorporation, at least for the business visas that would be relevant to this discussion. because it's the business that's applying for the visa on behalf of, if it's L1, then it's going to be for management people, or if it's E2 for investment, you have to have a fully functioning company with investment already made in order to apply for E2. So setup comes first. The US government makes you take all the risk first before they take the risk in giving out a visa. Do Dutch nationals have any special privileges or benefits to set up an import-export company? No. US law doesn't really have a preference system. They just know that you're not an American and you need a visa to come in. Maybe the reviewer has, likes or dislikes Dutch, but just because the city right where I am now used to be Dutch territory doesn't make it any friendlier to the Dutch. And okay, one last question. So Murtada Haddad says, is opening a branch is better or forming a new company? Here's a reason that opening a branch is probably not a good idea. Okay, first, not surprisingly, a branch office would be subject to the branch profits tax, which is technically a tax, but it really just makes a foreign company pay the same amount of tax as a US company would or US business would. So it evens out, but the expense, the inconvenience, and the reason it's not nice is that it's an accounting headache, and so your accountants will charge extra for it. If they don't charge extra for it, then you better watch out and get a new accountant because you're going to get hit with a lot of penalties from the IRS. The bigger reason is that if you use a branch, then your parent company has a toehold in the United States, or maybe more, which leaves it open to US litigation being able to seize assets from overseas. If you use a subsidiary, it's the subsidiary that becomes the target within the United States, and you can pretty much adjust the size of that target. If it's a branch, then you're wide open to the US litigation system, and I don't think that that's a good thing. So, and with that, we're out of time to do questions. So let me wrap up by saying, now that you know what you need to do to a large extent, and the recording will be available soon, so you'll be able to review, for example, the whole chart from the very beginning, then that we'd like to start from the end and work back. That way you can avoid the most serious business killing mistakes. If you want to be a successful business, you don't want to be worried about compliance any more than you have to. But then again, that's one reason that we recommend for many people from outside the country, and you're setting up a US company, then go into Mrs. Walsh's class. She's very strict. Yes, she'll hit you on the wrist or on the back of your hand with a ruler. It hurts a lot. So you follow the rules. That way, every time somebody has a question, whether it's litigation, justified or not, visa applications, tax returns, if you've been doing everything very strictly and by the book, then you don't have to worry about compliance. You've already done it. And it just becomes a habit. Hopefully you can grow to the point where you have somebody else who understands local rules and they take care of it for you, and then you don't have to worry about it. So think from the end in order to get to the success that you're looking for. And then start from the beginning by setting up with those things in mind. And with that, I'd like to turn over everything and thank you all for coming over. I'll turn over the mic to Gotham for his final remarks. And thank you very much for attending and for all your questions.
Thank you, John. Okay, I hope you've all enjoyed today's live webinar. Thank you all for listening and participating. And thanks also to John for presenting the webinar today and to Ichen for the online Q&A help. I could hear her frantically typing as she answers all of the questions that kept coming in. Watch your email for a recording and to hear about future webinars. As you can see, setting up a company can be complicated, so please do leave it to the experts I can talk from first-hand experience how beneficial it was when USA Corporate helped set up my company. And as John mentioned, if you're considering creating a company in the US, please contact the team at sales@usa-corporate.com, and they'll be happy to help. Until then, goodbye.